Stage right. Okay. Good morning.
You need to come over here, Jimmy, to be in the camera. Thank you.
I was trying to do this in the closet, but they said I had to come out here. Welcome to another FURL gathering. We have the esteemed Mr. Tom Burleson here this morning. And I'm going to read this title, Narrative versus History, the Influence of Economics and Politics Behind Slavery and Civil Rights. I was so relieved when I saw this PowerPoint when I got here, because I looked for my own sheet of it upstairs before I came down, and I couldn't find it. And I knew it was, as I told Tom, a very long-winded title, and I couldn't. However, the production and the presentation will not be long-winded. Now, I have one other thing aside from the usual pitch for, first of all, thanking you for coming, thanking Tom for taking the time to make this preparation and presentation. Some of you will know that this is about the third or fourth time that he's presented for FURL, and without exception, they have been excellent presentations, very thorough and very complete. The one other thing, well, there's two other things. Our usual pitch for the fall, if you have any suggestions for courses or leaders or both, please pass them on to anyone within the FURL group. I also have something that in my lifetime of making introductions that I've never had the opportunity to do before. Tom, this is one of these little in-the-moment things that just happened about 3 minutes ago, but I was formally asked to announce that in the audience that Mr. Burleson has a resident heckler who's in a kind of a reddish, tweedy, LLB-looking shirt here. Doesn't have much hair on top. In fact, has even a little less hair than me, and is sitting on the the third row on my left in an aisle seat. And is now moving towards the exit. Anyhow, enough. Welcome, Tom. Thank you so much, and have a great time.
Thank you, Jim. I just want you to know that I know most of the people in here quite well, and several of them are trained professional hecklers, so it's not, and I've put up with them all now for several years, so it's not something new. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate you being here. Today is, I'm getting a lot of feedback here, Brian. I don't know if I'm too loud or what, which is probably true. I'm always too loud. But I really appreciate you coming. This is not a lightweight topic, and you will not go out of here today with a warm and fuzzy feeling. You will go out of here wondering how our nation could have engaged in such horrific conduct. And it's not something that our nation should be proud of. It's often called the original sin of America. That being said, that's bad enough. But to see people want to take this history and distort it for other purposes, for a narrative purpose, thus the title, and getting away from, as best we can figure out what the true history is. History is also open to interpretation depending on how you read it or what sources you use, and you can move history around to make a point. But the point of real history and people who study history is to try to come up with the best factual basis that you can about what happened. Just a little bit about who I am for those of you who may not know. For one thing, I have a degree in history. I also have a degree in psychology, and I have a minor in music. And I hasten to add that I have never made a dime from either of those degrees, but they have enriched my life tremendously. And so it's when I see things that kind of throw me off a little bit from a historical perspective, I delve back into my history background. And this is one of those. When I was an FBI agent, Congress passed the Omnibus Crime Bill and Safe Streets Act of 1968, and that act gave the FBI and other legitimate law enforcement agencies the ability to use electronic surveillance, microphones, wires, cameras, all of that kind of stuff, which in those days, none of it was digital, and a camera that we'd try to use would be, as big as a shoebox. But anyway, in order to do that, as the young agent who had the case, I would have to send an affidavit to a United States District Court judge who was authorized to approve those Title IIIs, they were called Title III warrants, and that judge would go over that affidavit with a fine-tooth comb. And then I would receive a phone call for Agent Burleson to report to Judge Brown's chambers. So I would go see Judge Brown, and he would have me take a seat in front of his desk, and he would start ripping up my affidavit. And he would say, Agent Burleson, I see here that you have used a confidential source as part of your information. Did you vet that source? Has he provided you with information in the past? Have you proved the veracity of this source? I need to know more about that source. And so I would orally relay that to him. And everything in that affidavit had to be fact. It had to be backed up by something. If I referred to a document, where did that document come from? Was it legally obtained, or is it fruit of the poisoned tree that can't be used as evidence? Yada, yada, yada. Very strict. If I had gone, on the other hand, if I had gone into him and presented this, and the judge looked at the affidavit, and I would say, well, Judge, this is my narrative of what happened. I don't have any real evidence to back it up, but this is what I think went on. It would be, get out of my office and turn in your badge and your credentials and get out, and don't ever come back. So that's historical fact versus narrative, and that's my point. A lot of people say, we can't talk anymore. We just can't discuss things with one another. We can't say what we need to say or what we want to say. But I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to say pretty much what I need to say. And you're going to hear bad words in here. You're going to hear Negro, you're going to hear nigger, you're going to hear Negra, you're going to hear all of the words that we put the N word in front of. Historically, they existed, and we're going to do all of that. And we're going to say those things that need to be said. Now, we hear a lot about hate speech. That's hate speech. You can't say that. That's hate speech. How many people in the United States have been prosecuted for hate speech? Anybody? No. Yeah. 0. Brian is cheating. The reason that nobody's ever been prosecuted for hate speech is there is no law in the United States against hate speech. A lot of people think there is. There's a law against certain hate crimes, but it's the crime itself. Hate is just tacked onto it. If it's a hate crime and it involves assault, it's assault. It's not hate. You can't prosecute anybody for that. And the reason that we don't do that is we have this wonderful document that you now see before you, and that is the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And the Supreme Court, several states have tried to pass hate speech statutes in their state legislatures, and the Supreme Court has struck them all down because it violates the freedom of speech. And the best argument against hate speech or any other speech being prohibited is the best defense against bad speech is more speech. More speech that clarifies, more speech that brings truth, more speech that defeats the bad ideas contained in what we might classify as hate speech. So there is no such thing legally in the United States as hate speech. We can say whatever we want, and thanks be to God for our marvelous Constitution. I am a strict constitutionalist, and you will see that as we go along. I spent my entire working life of 30 years upholding the Constitution of the United States, and I believe strongly in it. Has it needed to be amended, as happened in the First Amendment? Yeah. Did it need other amendments regarding slavery and the rights of black citizens in the United States? Yes, and we're going to talk about that. Our discussion is going to be in two parts. Today we're going to go from the colonial era, roughly, up to the Civil War. And that's a long time and a lot of stuff. And then next week, we're going to start at the Civil War and come forward through Reconstruction, the World Wars one and two, and to the Civil Rights Movement, and then to where we are today. So that's kind of the outline of what we're going to be doing. So if you have your seat belts on, I would suggest you strap them down, because we're going to get going now. So the first thing we need to address is narrative. And we've talked a little bit about narrative, but I want to read you the definition of narrative. It's a story or account of events, experiences, or the like, whether true or fictitious. Doesn't have to be true. A narrative does not have to be true. When somebody says we need to change the narrative of the history of the United States, they're not saying we need to change the truth of it. We're just going to change the narrative of it to reflect what I think or what I believe about this, or what my group believes about it. And the last thing that I have underlined there is a story that connects and explains a carefully selected of supposedly true events, experiences, or the like, intended to support a particular viewpoint or thesis. You see this in the media all the time. They will select a particular viewpoint or thesis, and then they will use only inculpatory information. Inculpatory information is something that tends to prove that what I'm saying is true. Exculpatory information tends to disprove what I'm saying. So you won't see any exculpatory information from your media outlets. All you will see is inculpatory information, that information that tends to support a particular position. That's dangerous. You can't do that. When I had young agents working for me in the FBI, they would often come to me and they would have decided, that David did that dastardly deed, David robbed that bank, or whatever it was. And they would have all this information that showed David robbed the bank, and it would all be inculpatory. Well, what else did you do? What did you show that David didn't rob the bank? Well, nothing. Well, you go back out and you find out why David couldn't have done this, because we got to have both sides when we go to trial with this. So anyway, that's what narrative is about. And what set me off with this was we hear a lot about the CRT, critical race theory, and we hear a lot about other things that are being distorted in our schools, and which we may believe are distortions, and I believe a lot of them are. And a lot of this began with something called the 1619 Project. How many of you have ever heard of the 1619 Project? Oh, we got hands here today. Okay, well, let's talk about the 1619 Project, because that's kind of where it all began. And ironically, just last week, Peggy and I spent the week up in Williamsburg, and this occurred right close to Williamsburg, in Jamestown, or in that area. Okay, let's look at what really happened at the 1619 Project, and it's not very complicated. In 1619, we like to say now in around August 20th or so, and as the person who was writing in his diary about this, 20 and odd African slaves, or African people, they weren't slaves at that point, arrived in Jamestown, in the Virginia colony. It was not the United States then, but anyway, these Africans came from well, I don't even see where it is now. Anyway, they were Ndongo Africans, and they were sold to Spanish slave traders because the Spanish and the Portuguese were primarily the people who got the slaves and transported them to South America and to the Caribbean primarily. But in the summer, the San Juan Batista that had these slaves on it was boarded by 2 English privateers off the coast of Venezuela. The White Line and the treasurers and these privateers, pirates, seized 50 or 60 of the remaining Africans that had survived the journey, and they sailed for Virginia. The White Line arrived in close to now is what is Hampton, Virginia, and the Africans were offloaded and bought for victuals. That probably means that they needed to reprovision their ships, so they traded the slaves for what they needed to reposition their ships. They were traded for victuals. And they were likely bought by Sir George Yardley, who was the governor of Virginia at that time, the colony, and the head quartermaster. And most of those 20 slaves stayed in the area around Jamestown. And here is how the 1619 Project kind of looks at this. The date and their story have become symbolic of slavery's roots. Despite captive Africans likely being present in the Americas in the 1400s and as early as 1526 in the region that would become the United States. So the basic premise that this story is, that this narrative is based on, gets off on the wrong foot because it's incorrect. And the 1619 Project was a project put together by New York Magazine and the New York Times. And it was put together by a journalist named Nicole Hannah-Jones. Anybody know that name? Yep. Okay, how do you know that name? Anybody want to tell us? Yes, Brian. Brian's a graduate of UNC at Chapel Hill.
She taught at UNC.
She taught at UNC. Oh. Yeah, and she was the head of the journalism department, I believe, wasn't she?
Well, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
That wasn't my major.
Anyway, she is no longer at UNC. She's somewhere else now. But anyway, she and an editor named Jake Silverstein of the New York Times and New York Times Magazine put this project together. And you can see the New York Times itself states that the purpose of the project was to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. Not history, but national narrative. And there's a whole lot to be said about that. All right, what I've done here is I'm using an awful lot of written language here for you. And I don't like to do that because what I would prefer you do is just kind of listen to me. And if you want to read along a little bit, I'm going to be pretty much reading what's up here because a lot of these things are, like this writing is from Nicole Hannah-Jones. She had this project was divided into several different components. Different Black authors wrote about different aspects of American society and about these events. But Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote the preface and the first article. So I'm just going to begin to read it to you. It is not a year that most Americans know as a notable date in our country's history. Those who do are at most a tiny fraction of those who can tell you that 1776 is the year of our nation's birth. What if, however, we were to tell you that this fact, which is taught in our schools and unanimously celebrated every 4th of July, is wrong, and that the country's true birth date, the moment that its defining contradictions first came into the world, was in late August 1619. And then I'm going to go on down to the underlined part. Out of slavery and the anti-Black racism it required grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, diet and popular music, the inequities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, the example it sets for the world as a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatreds that continue to plague it to this date. It is also about, and I'm going to go back a little bit, about chattel slavery, which I'll explain later, and she calls it, as a lot of people do, and I think rightly so, the original sin of the United States. So it's a troubling event. But let me just keep going here with the 1619 project. The goal of the 1619 project, a major initiative from the New York Times that this issue of the magazine inaugurates, is to refute American history. Now, see, that kind of hits me in the nose as a historian. I don't need to refute American history. I think we need to explain it, we need to look at it, we need to understand it, but do we need to refute it? That's a pretty strong phrase. Refute American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. Down again to the next underlined point, the first by the staff writer Nicole Hannah-Jones, and that's the first segment of several segments of the project, from whose mind this project sprang, provides the intellectual framework for the project and can be read as an introduction alongside the essays. You will find 17 literary works that bring to life key moments in African American history. These works are all original compositions by contemporary black writers who were asked to choose events on a timeline of the past 100 years. The poetry and fiction they created is arranged chronologically throughout the issue, and each work is introduced by the history to which the author is responding. Now, I think they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth here. They're saying we're using history as a basis, but then we're interpreting that history in a way that we don't have any real factual basis for. It's just our understanding of that. And that's okay, that's all right. But the problem is that this project has begun to be used as factual history by a lot of segments of folks in the United States who don't understand the real history. So the last bolded sentence, American history cannot be told truthfully without a clear vision of how inhuman and immoral the treatment of black Americans has been. Now, I agree completely with the last part of that statement. The treatment of black Americans has been inhuman and immoral and just awful. I can't find words enough, and you'll see as we go along how awful it has been. Probably far much more so than you have even thought about. By acknowledging this shameful history, which I hope we will do today, by trying hard to understand its powerful influence on the present, perhaps we can prepare ourselves for a more justice future. And I agree with that. That is the hope of this project. Okay, now, what happened was real historians in the United States, most of them college professors, and here's a list of them. Whoops, wait a minute. Here's a list of a lot of them. They just put the hammer to the New York Times for this project and for its inaccuracies. And one of the big inaccuracies that Jim wanted to focus on was that when the United States fought the Revolutionary War, a big part of that had to do with slavery because they were afraid that the British were going to outlaw slavery. So it was so important that we fought the revolution for that purpose. And that's not true, as some other folks will point out here in a few minutes. But anyway, here are some of the folks who got together and they wrote a document and sent it to the New York Times and about it. And they requested, as it says at the bottom, factual corrections accusing the project's creators of putting ideology before historical understanding. And that one sentence kind of explains what I'm trying to do today. We're trying to get past the ideology to historical understanding. We're going to focus on a guy named Sean Wilentz, who is a professor of American history at Princeton. Wilentz was kind of, all of these people wrote very similar documents, but I liked what Wilentz had to say, and we kind of have a connection with Princeton since one of our sons has a couple of master's degrees from there. Okay, so let me just read you about Sean Wilentz. Sean Wilentz is a proud liberal and sometimes hard-edged Democratic partisan. I like that. He is also a distinguished Princeton University historian whose academic work is broadly respected across the political spectrum. So what did Wilentz, did that change? Okay. I'm getting so I don't have to look back there anymore. So let's see what some of Wilentz had to say. The lead essay, as I told you before, was written by Nicole Hannah-Jones. And this is what Wilentz says. It's underlined there. It's rare, after all, to read a student get every single stated fact perfectly wrong in support of a proposition for which there is no other evidence cited on two of the most important topics in all of U.S. history, indeed all of modern history, the causes of the American Revolution and the origins of slavery. Pretty strong stuff. He said, but this wasn't a high school paper. It was the New York Times Magazine, and the author was, according to her contributors biography, a highly acclaimed journalist. Note, she is a journalist, not a historian. Big difference. The essay may have been historically fallacious, but it was also inflammatory and attention-getting. And then to the question about the slavery being the cause of the revolution, down at the bottom of that page, you should see an underlined area that says there is no evidence of a single colonialist expressing support for independence in order to protect slavery. The 1619 Project's claims were based not on historical sources, but on imputation and inventive mind reading. At the time of the Revolution, there was also considerably more in the way of anti-slavery politics in the colonies than in Britain proper. These are elementary facts. A response from the New York Times? Is that up there? Wow.
Absolutely.
I need a mirror somewhere. I could read it off of Wiz's head, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, the response from the New York Times was next to nothing. We are not going to change it. It's what we wrote, and it's what we're going to stay with. However, a critic named Brett Stevens of the Times claimed the differences showed that the newspaper was backing away from some of the initiative's more controversial claims. So that's really, kind of the focal point for what set me off on this thing was this project, which I didn't care for. So let's look at some of the history now. At this time, in 1775, it's hard to read that, there were three sections of colonies. There were the northern colonies, or the New England colonies, the middle colonies, which consisted of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, so on and so on, and then the southern colonies of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Those were the enslaved populations of the 13 colonies in 1770. Pretty remarkable. Some of the northern colonies didn't have too many slaves. Interesting that some of the smaller colonies, like Rhode Island, had 3,700 slaves. But if you come further south, you see where the slaves were really populated. Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, those three colonies. And slavery was different in those two populations. There was a difference between northern and southern slavery from the outset. Am I in your way? Can you see okay? Okay, okay.
Dead in line with the screen. There you go. That's
Now, can you see? No. Okay, you can see, good. And a lot of these things are obvious. Slavery grew quickly in the South because of the region's agriculture-based economy and the need for labor on plantations and smaller farms. So back to the original premise, that's economics. That's economics right here. And all of slavery is based on economics and politics. All of the actions regarding slavery are governed by those two things. Now, next week when we get into the Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws, a lot of that was hatred. A lot of that was racism. This is not particularly racism. This is economics and politics. Another reason slavery developed was differently in New England was the culture of indentured servitude. Everybody know what indentured servitude was? Okay, indentured servitude was when a person would sell themselves or somebody else would sell them as labor to someone for a defined period, usually 7 years. And after that person had worked off those 7 years, the person was free. Slavery kind of started that way in the colonies because that's the way we looked at it. But then it changed to something else, which was very ugly. Enslaved Africans quickly replaced indentured servants on plantations in Maryland, Virginia, and other southern colonies, and we'll look at why that happened. Still, the New England colonies began to show differences in how they dealt with slavery. These actions did not end slavery. However, they were a sign of what was to come in the New England colonies, and indeed states that had not yet been developed. Okay, that really terrible thing that happened with slavery as it developed, and it was mostly in the South. Now, some of you Southern folks who grew up in the South are not going to like a lot of the things I'm going to say, so just grab on. But chattel slavery developed. And you hear that term a lot, chattel slavery. Chattel, in general use, is a personal possession. My car is chattel. If I were a farmer, my cow would be chattel. My horse would be cattle. My slaves, after this period, were chattel. I owned them. They were not working as indentured servants. They belonged to me. They were my property. I own them. And that is the really onerous part to me of slavery. And that is it's not the work, it's not the labor. They were going to do that anyway, no matter where they lived. It was the loss of identity, the loss of who I am. And you saw in the 1960s a lot of signs that said, I am a man. Would you have thought that that went all the way back to chattel slavery? It does, because they were not men. They were property. And that is just the horrific part of slavery to me. The loss of freedom, the loss of identity, the loss of being a human being. That is the really horrific part to me of slavery. The enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work without wages, as distinguished from other systems of forced, unpaid, or low-wage labor bondage servants, is considered to be a form of slavery. Now, in order to make this happen, ironically, these had to be encoded into laws. They had to have some weight in a colonial legislature. Massachusetts did it first and adopted the Massachusetts slave codes in 1641, much earlier, I might add, than 1619. Says that we could have slaves. Slavery was allowed in cases where slaves were taken in just wars. What they were referring to was Native American tribes or Indian tribes where the colonists had taken slaves from those peoples and had made them slaves. Taken in just wars, or as willingly sell themselves, as I described to you earlier, as bond servants, or are sold to us by somebody else who may have that person's bond. Those bonds could be sold. A 1670 law made it legal for the children of enslaved women to be sold into bondage beginning in 1690. The colony had laws restricting the movement of black men and women. So things were beginning to change. Virginia took them a step farther in 1705. Series of laws enacted by the colony of Virginia's House of Burgesses, which is, it's still, we're not the United States yet. They enacted these slave clauses. They established new property rights. Property rights, that's important because that identifies and codifies chattel slavery. Property rights, and it's property rights of the slave owner. The slave was his property. So it's property rights of the slave owner. Allowed for a legal free trade of slaves with protections granted by the courts, established separate courts of trial for blacks, prohibited blacks regardless of free status from owning arms. Whites could not be employed by any blacks, and allowed for the apprehension of suspected runaways. The law was devised to establish a greater level of control over the increasing African slave population of Virginia. It also served to socially segregate white colonialists from black enslaved persons, making them desperate groups, hindering their ability to unite. The unity of commoners was a perceived fear of the Virginia aristocracy, which had to be addressed, and who wished to prevent a repeat of events such as Bacon's Rebellion, which occurred 29 years earlier. The Virginia colonists wanted to perpetuate the British form of social hierarchy, that kind of thing, and they wanted to separate, keep the races and people, classes of people separate. So that was what those slave codes were about. All right. So we get up to the time when we're getting ready to form our own nation. And what part did slavery play in that? It played a tremendous part. Most people poo-poo it and say, well, the United States just looked the other way over slavery. Slavery was of deep concern to a lot of people, particularly people that in recent times have been given a lot of bad press. Thomas Jefferson being one of them, and I'll explain that to you as we go along here in just a few minutes. George Washington and some others. They deeply wanted to abolish slavery. And you need to understand that there's a difference between an abolitionist and someone who wanted to do away with slavery. Washington and Jefferson and a lot of the other founders felt that slavery was such an onerous institution that it would die a natural death. The abolitionists took a much more aggressive position and said, we have to take strong political military action to abolish slavery. For example, Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. You need to understand that at the outset, at least before he became president. After he became president and after the war started, he became an abolitionist. And I'll explain how all that happened to you later on. All right. There were two factors again that we're talking about, politics and economics. The first is the framers of the Constitution believed that concessions on slavery was the price for the support of the Southern delegates for a strong central government. Remember, we had no central government. It was all about individual states, individual colonies. They were convinced that if the Constitution restricted the slave trade, and it does restrict the slave trade, we'll talk about that in just a second, the Carolinas and Georgia would refuse to join the Union. That's the politics. The economics that drives the politics is Southern colonies were by far the wealthiest colonies with the exportation of cash crops, particularly tobacco. Notice not cotton yet. We'll come into that. Particularly tobacco. The economy of the new republic would undoubtedly collapse with the loss of its primary economic engine. Just makes sense. If we want to have a nation, we got to do compromises. And this was the compromise that they made. All right, so we get to the drafting of the Constitution. And here, the Constitution has 3 clauses that relate to, note, people held to service or labor. The word slavery or slave does not appear in the Constitution of the United States. This word, this phrase describing slaves, both indentured servants and slaves, appears in the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution declared that any person who was not free could be counted as 3/5 of a free individual for the purposes of determining congressional representation. So what is that? Politics, right? So a lot of these states, as time went on, there were more, as many, and in some cases more slaves than there were people who were not slaves. So the 3/5 clause thus increased the political power of the slaveholding states. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. Very important, something that very few people know anything about. The migration or importation of such persons, slaves, as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress. In other words, the importation of slaves cannot be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, 1808. Excuse me. But a tax or duty may be placed, and that is economics, because slaves drove the economic engine. Without slaves, there would be no production on this scale in the South. So that's economics. The 4th clause, Article 4, Clause 3, erroneously called the Fugitive Slave Clause, says no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof going to another state. In other words, they can be captured in the other state, and the other state has to return them. And then a little bit later on, we'll be talking about the Dred Scott decision of 1850, and that's had a big impact on that. So those are the 3 clauses that affected the Constitution of the United States when it was written. So, got a question for you. There were 12,500,000 slaves captured and deported from Africa. How many? 12,500,000. Brian's gone. And I've told some of the other of you how many there were. How many slaves of those 12,500,000 came to the United States? We've got good records, pretty good records about this.
Half.
How many?
Half. 1 million.
Okay, 1 million, got half, 6 million, roughly. Anybody else? 388,000. That's all. Most people don't know that. This clause in the Constitution was put in there by Thomas Jefferson. And here's how Thomas Jefferson had an impact upon that. Between 1525, a long time before 1619, and 1866, the entire history of the slave trade, according to the Transatlantic Slave Database, 12.5 million were shipped, 10.7 million survived, and most of them went to South America and to the Caribbean. And only 388,000, that's right, a tiny percentage came to the United States. And this is information, by the way, from Henry Louis Gates. Anybody know who he is? Yes. Harvard history professor. I like him very much. A lot of people don't. But Gates pretty much is a straight historical kind of guy. He uses history a bit from time to time to promote certain causes, but he's a good historian, and I like him, and we're going to be using him a lot in our next session next week. Okay, so what did Jefferson have to do with that? The importation of slaves into the United States ended in 1808. People don't realize that. They think, well, slaves were imported all the way up until the time of the Civil War. Nope. Importation of slaves from Africa ended in 1808. And who was president in 1807 that put all this together? Thomas Jefferson. And it was Jefferson's initiative because they said you cannot pass a law until the first minute past midnight beginning 1808. So in 1807, Jefferson put together this initiative in Congress. They put the bill together, and the first minute after 1808, importation of slaves ended into the United States. Thomas Jefferson. Big contradiction there. A lot of people say, well, Jefferson owned slaves. Jefferson had perhaps a mistress that was a slave, yada, yada, yada. So it's kind of a contradiction. But there are other contradictions. We'll talk about somebody as recently as Lyndon Johnson, who was also a blatant racist, but passed a lot of important legislation. So it's an interesting question. How many of you knew that, what I just told you about importation of slaves ending? None of you? You did. All right. Howie.
20 years after the Constitution.
Yes, exactly. And that was designed that way, and it was designed by Jefferson and some of the other founders to be that way, because they knew if they tried to do it when the country was founded, it would not happen. But they put it far enough down the road, and they made it happen.
Tom, I don't know where I heard this or read it, but when they were voting on independence from 1776, that the Carolinas said, we will not vote for, to form, like you said, this nation.
Right.
But you've got to promise not to mention slavery for 10 years, and that's the only way we're going to.
Well, that's what happened.
So
That's what happened, yeah. All righty. North Carolina's got a kind of sordid history, folks. I hate to tell you that, along with a lot of the other states. All right. So this is how the importation of slaves ends. Jefferson says, I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights. Listen to that language, those violations of human rights. I mean, the founders understood what was going on, but because of politics and economics, they were not able, their hands were tied. They really couldn't do anything if they wanted to have a nation. So their hands were tied. Violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, and which the morality and reputation and the best interests of our country have long been eager to prescribe. So the slaves, as of the first constitutionally allowed moment of January 1st, 1808, this legislation was passed. Yes?
Question, this ended legal slave trade.
I'm sorry?
This ended legal slave trade. How about illegal continued, or was it?
Illegal continued, but not on a great level. It was too costly to do that, and I'll explain what happened to cause that not to happen in just a second. Okay, major cash crops are the southern colonies, and again, remember the South was driving the economy of the nation. The North was developing more of an industrial economy, but the Industrial Revolution had not gained enough ground yet. Enough inventions had not been made, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, to really go forward with it. So these are the cash crops. And the big one was, well, they're not in any order, was rice, probably the biggest. Tobacco was probably the biggest, excuse me. Then rice, then indigo. Lacey, thank you. If it hadn't been for Cone Mills and using indigo to dye their pants, because Lacey wouldn't be sitting here at River Landing today. And a lot of other folks here in Greensboro wouldn't be sitting here. Flax. Flax was a plant that was used to get fiber from, to weave. Hemp, also grown for fiber, not for recreation in those days. And it was made burlap and ropes and that kind of stuff. Very important. Again, note the absence of cotton on the list and stay tuned. And then after about 1808, slaves were the production of slaves was a big income producer in the United States. And I'll explain how that happened. Okay, there's a little bit of information about Lacey's blue jeans. Lacey was with Cone Mills, by the way. Anybody else make blue jeans in the room? Anybody else in the fabric business, the textile industry? Nobody. I'm really surprised. Wow. But anyway, there was a young, actually it didn't start out to be very big, and this young woman down in the South, and that tells the story here. By the way, it's a little bit off the subject, but I have copies of these slides, and Brian will be glad to make you a copy of all of these slides, and you can take them home and read about it. So if you want it, just get your name to Brian, and he'll either make you a copy or send you an email of them. But it may help, because I don't have time to read everything that's on there. So what happened in Virginia particularly, where a lot of cotton was grown? Well, tobacco is a luxuriant crop, and it really bleeds from the soil, takes everything out of the soil. So the land in Virginia essentially kind of played out, and so they needed to turn somewhere else to get more stuff. So that's a tobacco basket. Those are called hands of tobacco. Some of you may have even worked on a farm or helped with tobacco raising, like I did. Lacey has. There's a tobacco auction in the old days. We used to go to the tobacco auctions in October up in the mountains and early November, and that was the big cash crop for folks when I was growing up. And people would rely on that one source of income to pay all of their bills for the year. So it's pretty exciting. There's the indigo thing. Okay, now we get down to cotton. All right, overproduction of tobacco was a big cause of switching over to cotton. The Industrial Revolution was another big cause. The Industrial Revolution was, for example, the invention of the cotton gin, spinning jennies in the North and in England, steam engine, railroads, all of those things. The Industrial Revolution contributed to the growth of cotton. And the Indian Removal Act of 1830, also known as the Trail of Tears, and then the expanding market for cotton in England and in the northern United States. And the transportation, building of railroads, all of this stuff was coming about all at this time, and it made it very important. So cotton went from a crop that was very hard to grow and very hard to prepare to use, but with the invention of the cotton gin, things changed. Now I'm going to really rush through here. The cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney. Keep your cotton picking hands off my gin, right? Everybody heard that? Okay. Eli Whitney was from Massachusetts, went to school at Yale, came south after graduation to be a private tutor, and he actually went to live on the plantation owned by Catherine Greene for the widow of who? Yeah, okay. And for whom Greensboro is named. And she was down in Savannah, near Savannah, a plantation called Mulberry Grove. So he goes down there, and most historians think that Greene and her overseer had probably come up with the idea of the gin, but maybe had not put it together. Maybe he didn't have the mechanical ability to put it together. So Whitney goes down, they put the gin together, and again, Greene was not able to, women didn't have political standing in those days, so Greene could not patent it, so Whitney had it patented, so it's in his name. And prior to that, it took 5 slaves 1 day to prepare 1 pound of cotton for shipment. A gin, the very rudimentary gin that you see here, could with 1 slave, perhaps 2, gin 5 pounds of cotton in a day. And that was just the beginning. And Whitney's idea was that he would lease these cotton gins to farmers, and they would gin their own cotton, but they didn't pay much attention to his patent, and they saw better ways to do it. So they stole his patent and stole his idea and made all kinds of new gins. And then gins later on, and you all will remember this if you grew up in the South, gins were located in communities in small towns. And people would truck their cotton to the gin to be ginned, and then it would be packaged into bales and shipped out. Then the steam engine came along and was invented in England, and probably much earlier than most of you think, in 1712, but then it was improved upon in the United States, and Fulton developed a much better steam engine, and they became to be used inside factories that had relied on water power. Okay, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, or the Trail of Tears, because the land was beginning to be played out, and a lot of the other land in the South was not really good for growing cotton, there was all of this part of the interior of the United States in what is now western Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, all of that, and southern Tennessee, all of that land was occupied by Indians, Native Americans. And so Andrew Jackson, who was a real, not one of the nicest folks in the world, decided that all of this land that the Indians were on could be used for growing cotton. Now, he had a strong group of entrepreneurs and developers behind him, plantation owners that wanted to do that wanted to get this land. So he came up with this phony idea and was able to get the Indian Removal Act of 1830 passed. And so all of these Indians were removed off of this property in the South, and it was used to grow plantations, grow crops on. And you can see there, those areas in dark green are primarily the areas where there were large concentrations of Indian tribes. But all of those Indians were moved west of the Mississippi, and it opened all of that property for development. And you'll see later in another slide that I'm going to show you that that very area is where the really concentrated cotton production began. So with the invention of the cotton gin and other industrial developments in the Industrial Revolution, cotton becomes literally white gold. And the more you can grow, the better it gets. Now, so as they're moving west, as these folks, as the people are moving west, where are they going to get slaves from? Got to have slaves. They didn't have engines. They didn't have tractors. They couldn't farm. I mean, you can go up north, up where Bill and Perky are from, and half a dozen people can farm 1,000 acres with the heavy equipment that we have today to do that with. But that was not the case. Slavery was the engine that drove it. And so in a book called The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, I'm going to read you what this guy says. In the span of a single lifetime, the South grew from a narrow coastal strip of worn-out tobacco plantations to a subcontinental cotton empire. By 1861, it had 5 times as many slaves as it had during the Revolution and was producing 2 billion pounds of cotton a year. It was through slavery and slavery alone that the United States achieved a virtual monopoly on the production of cotton, the key raw material of the Industrial Revolution, and was transformed into a global power rivaled only by England. On the backs of enslaved Americans. By the middle of the 19th century, as I talked to you earlier, the The cotton belt extended from Maryland to East Texas. Most extensive cotton was in those areas that I showed you earlier. By 1800, American cotton production was 156,000 bales. By 1860, the total crop of ginned cotton in the United States was 2,154,820,800 pounds, or 5,387 and 52 bales of 400 pounds each. So you can see how the United States became the cotton producer of the world. Now, back to my friend here about where the slaves came from. A very troubling book written by Ned and Constance Sublette talks about how Virginia, in particular, became a slave-producing state. Slaves could not be imported. It was too difficult to try to sneak them by. And so slaves were very valuable, and they became a very valuable crop of the South. So just one line there down at the bottom in that last paragraph that I've highlighted. By a conservative estimate, in 1860, at the outbreak of the Civil War, the total value of American slaves was $4 billion. Total currency in circulation at that time was only $4,335.4 million was in circulation. And the value of all of the farmland in the South was only almost $1.92 billion. So the biggest asset that the plantations owned were slaves. Biggest asset by far. So the slaves, and I won't go into this a lot, but a lot of these plantation owners and business people formed banks, and they would use slaves as collateral, like you would use your house. If you got a mortgage on your house would serve as your collateral. A lot of these plantation owners who wanted to increase their production, who wanted to buy more land, would borrow the money and use the slaves that they had for collateral. They would actually put them together in the form of bonds and use those slave bonds to buy property. Okay, so they're running out of land and they need more land. Manifest destiny. You've all heard that term. We always thought of that as a good term. Not necessarily, because what manifest destiny did was it started the beginning of states' rights and states' issues, and which states were going to be slave states and which states were going to be free states. And that caused a lot of trouble. Politics again, involving slavery and civil rights. So the Western expansion raised the big question of free or slave states. You all have heard of the Missouri Compromise, and that's when Missouri was admitted to the United States as a slave state, but in order to maintain balance, Maine came in as a free state. And then we have the Compromise of 1850, which is a little bit later on, that again divided the country and decided who was going to be a slave state, who was going to be a free state, and a lot of negotiating went on. Politics, again, dealing with slavery. And then the Compromise of 1850, when it was all over, came to look like that. That's what the United States looks like. And if you will notice in just a few minutes, I'm going to show you the election of 1860 that will show how this is essentially how Lincoln was elected. All right, going on to something that you've heard about called the Dred-Scott decision. Now, the Dred-Scott decision is very, very important because what it does was, a few minutes ago I talked about slaves being property. Well, Dred Scott and his wife were slaves, but they were taken to Wisconsin and Michigan, two states that were not slave states. Under the law at that time, they probably could have been freed and stayed there, but for some reason they did not. Later, when they were brought back to Missouri, they sued, and their case initially was upheld, and I'm just going to go through this and then you can read about it. but their case was initially upheld. Then it was overturned by the local courts, and then they actually, now 2 slaves with a lot of support from their church and from their friends, because we're getting to some really radical Republican abolitionists are beginning to really get active in the North again. And so they they brought their case to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said their ruling, which was written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was a part of who was from the South, who was part of the Southern aristocracy, wrote this about the Dred Scott, about the decision. In Dred Scott versus Sandiford, which said that all people of African descent, free or enslaved, were not United States citizens. They were property under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. The Fifth Amendment has to do with you don't have to incriminate yourself, but it also has a section about property rights. About property rights cannot be infringed. So if slaves are property, you cannot infringe on their property. So these slaves, not being citizens, didn't even have the right to bring a case to the Supreme Court. So they lost that case, and the impact was that it triggered and outraged these abolitionists that were called the radical Republicans in the North at the Supreme Court ruling, and really started an aggressive movement toward what later became the Civil War. If you'll notice now on this slide, that shows the enslaved population, the dark red areas. If you notice, Virginia is quite large, South Carolina, and then the areas further over to the west are quite large. Look on does anybody know the borderline of Tennessee? Can you see the borderline between Tennessee and North Carolina? Yeah. Look up in that northeastern corner, and you see it's a very light yellow color, which was next to nothing. That's where I grew up. In the second session, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my history, which is very different from growing up in the Jim Crow South. We actually, up there, protected runaway slaves. And slave hunters, not a good idea to come up there. So like people looking for stills, it was not a good idea to come into that area looking for stills or slaves. You might not make it out. Okay, so let's talk about the Civil War. As we would say when I was hoeing not cotton, we didn't grow cotton, hoeing corn as a young guy, we are coming into the short rows now. We're about to get done. Okay, let's talk about the Civil War. What were the causes of the Civil War? Great discussions today are held about that. People, the South denies that it was over slavery. They want to say it was over states' rights. And no. And they're all right. That's exactly the way it was. For the South, a big cause of the, and we'll talk about economics, at the time of the Revolution, the strongest economy was the South. It was that way at the time of the Civil War. It was still the strongest economy. The North was developing into an industrial economy. The Industrial Revolution was gaining speed. Factories were being built. New products were being made. All of that was giving rise to the North. But the Civil War and the continuing Industrial Revolution would even continue the North to grow even more. So it was economics, but still the strong engine was in the South for money. The states' rights and politics, since gaining independence, states' rights had been a continuing battle. And as I showed you that when we talked about the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. So all of that's about states' rights. What rights does a state have to be a free state or a slave state? Back and forth. So that's a big part of it. And in slavery, the moral implication of slavery was not the major cause of the war as much as the economic destruction its abolition would cause the South and indeed the nation. Slavery was and had been for many years at the center of the most visceral political disagreements. If the morality of slavery was at the front, why did Lincoln wait until January 1st, 1863 to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, the reason he didn't was because he felt like the early founders that slavery was such an onerous institution that it would collapse of its own weight. But it didn't. And why didn't it? Because it was too valuable. It was white gold. It was cotton. And cotton could not be produced without slaves. And slavery was not going to go away because of that. The South was, we're going to talk politics now. Remember the First Amendment. We talk about whatever we want. The politics was 100% Democrat and had been since the time of Andrew Jackson. They controlled everything. The North was all about Republicans, and there's the map that shows that. And then you have a lot of transition states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, not so much. They were really hardcore South, but Maryland was one of those transition states. Because if you'll recall, when Lincoln was elected president, his vice president was who? Andrew. And where was Johnson from? Tennessee. So he was actually one of those Tennessee Democrats, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Why was he with Lincoln? Lincoln was a consummate politician. Lincoln really knew what he was doing. And he knew he needed Southern support, so he selected Johnson to be his vice president. And it worked out okay because Lincoln was a strong leader, and Johnson was less than that, as we find out later on. Okay, so when did the war begin? There it is. Any Citadel graduates? Thank you for the war. Because the Citadel cadets essentially bombed Fort Sumter or started the attack on Fort Sumter. All right, here we go. Emancipation Proclamation. Brian, put a sock in it. In other words, don't answer. Okay, and some of the rest of you know the answer too, but if I've told you this, don't answer it. How many slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? And there were 4 million, I'll help you. There were 4 million slaves in the South at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. 4 million. How many were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? Very good, Rhodey. Why?
Because of economics again.
No. Good guess, though. I like your guessing. Okay, Rhodey's right. Not one slave was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation, excuse me, oh, I'm about to cough, but I'm about to get done. The Emancipation Proclamation is what we would today call an executive order. Congress didn't pass it, didn't have anything to do. It was just Lincoln just wrote this nice letter. And why did he do that? Well, initially, the North became involved because they wanted to preserve the Union in the Civil War. They did not want this Union separated. And that was the big reason they came in. But now we're into 1863, and the war is not going well. And the North is losing its interest in this separation thing. And so Lincoln needed to change the focus of why they're fighting. So it became, last night we, excuse me. Last night we Okay, last night we sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and we talked about how we die to make men free. All of that came about as a result of Lincoln changing the focus of the war. That's why the Battle Hymn of the Republic, traditionally in the South, is not sung very much. It was never very popular in the South. Those of you who grew up in the South, I mean, if you grew up maybe in the 40s, you were singing it, but prior to that, it was not sung very much. So anyway, the war was not going well. Lincoln needed a change. He needed to get things going in another direction. So he said, okay, we're going to free the slaves. And what the Emancipation Proclamation says is that all of those slaves within those states that have seceded from the Union are hereby and forever free. Well, Lincoln didn't have any control over those states. So really, nobody was freed. It was a nice gesture, but it was just all about politics. But it really had nothing to do with what was going on. Okay, so what did free the slaves? I just put it up there for you. In 1865, while Lincoln was still president, he was able to get past the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. That was a really magnificent, gigantic accomplishment because the country was still divided, was still at war, and for him to be able to get that approved, because there were still some Democrats in Congress, there were still some Democrats in the North who were not in favor of this at all, but the Republicans were able to prevail, and some Democrats came over, and they were able to approve the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Big, big event. And there's a great movie about that called Lincoln. Daniel Day-Lewis plays Lincoln in it. If you've never seen it, go to Netflix or wherever, rent it and watch it before next week, because it talks about getting this approved. It's really a great movie, and some people have said that Daniel Day-Lewis does the greatest job portraying Lincoln of anybody, and I would agree with that. And it's historically very accurate.
The name is Lincoln, the movie?
Yeah, Lincoln.
How many states were required to pass the 13th Amendment since
Well,
the
that's
South was still not part of the Union?
that I can't give you an exact number right now, but because I don't remember, quite frankly. But because it was a very complex and very difficult time. Most of the southern states had not been readmitted into the Union yet. That didn't occur until after Reconstruction. And it was a very, they had withdrawn, most of those states, when they withdrew from the United States, they withdrew their congressmen. They called them back home. Some, like Tennessee and Maryland and some of the other border states that I mentioned, were still represented in Congress. So I don't have an answer, but I will have by next week for you. I'll have an exact answer for you. Okay, so then other events occurred that put us on a better path, we hoped. And that was in 1868, the 14th Amendment passed, granting citizenship, big move, to African Americans. And why do you think the big move was to get them citizenship?
So they could vote.
Yes. Kathy, give Kathy,
Some things never change.
give Kathy a vote.
Exactly.
And that's politics. But it's a good thing. It's a good thing. So they were granted citizenship because only citizens of the United States can vote. Now people will talk about, these aliens are coming to the United States and they're all voting. No, they're not. It's against the Constitution. In some states, they've allowed illegal aliens, if you want to call them that, whatever you want to call them, is they've allowed them to vote, but it's strictly in local elections, not in federal elections. It's against the Constitution. You have to be a citizen to vote. And so in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave citizens the right to vote. So next week, how am I doing here? I'm a little over. Can you make it, Rhodey? Can you last? Okay. Next week we're going to talk about Reconstruction, or the lack thereof. Reconstruction was a big, momentous, gigantic failure in the United States. And I don't know what they could have done much more differently than what they did, but it was a big failure. And it lasted from 1865, the end of the war, until 1877, when federal troops were removed from the South. And then we get into an era of Jim Crow and Southern legislatures, state legislatures, passing all kinds of restrictive voting laws, which are all patently unconstitutional, but nobody had the courage, the politics again, to do anything about it. And it was a horrible time in the southern United States. And we talk about, well, the Civil War ended I hear people say this, the Civil War ended in 1865. Why are we concerned about, well, the Civil War didn't end in 1865. The shooting ended in 1865, but it was the early 70s before we really got anything done in civil rights. And you all know that because you lived through it. You were a part of it. And next week's going to be sensitive. I'll tell you right now, because we lived through it, and we know about it, and we have history, and we have the history of our families. I mean, you know, I'm almost 81 years old, and you know, we are a product of what we learned from our families. And some of us may still hold those racist thoughts and ideas. And it may be something that we'll never be able to overcome or do anything about. But those are the things that we need to talk about today, just what that means. And so those were, I got into one of next week's slides. Anyway, that's the end. That's
Thank you.
all I can tell you.
That was wonderful.
And Jim, I want to note that we didn't have to call 911. There were no fist fights, and I saw no blood. Thank you. Yeah, wait till next week. It does get a little personal.